Anyway, it's great to be here among you. And I had a look at your website before I accepted the invitation and before I came, and I can see you've been doing good work and you've had some great speakers. So I feel really honored to be among them and to be having you invite me to speak to you. As far as what I'm going to say, if you want to interrupt at any time, that's all right. Especially if I say something that you don't really understand, please feel free to interrupt. But if it's something that requires a longer explanation, maybe wait to the end. So I'd like to start with a little survey. I'd like to ask you, how many of you have heard of John Stanley Plaskett? But that's kind of a stupid question to ask because you've all seen the publicity for the talk. So let's go back about a year ago, and I will say, imagine yourself a year ago. Had you heard of John Stanley Plaskett? If you have, hands up. Oh, 1, 2, 3. That's good. Well, you three are well informed, and the rest of you are in good company, because from what I have seen of Canadians' knowledge of John Stanley Plaskett, it's almost anybody I speak to says, who? So don't feel embarrassed if you've never heard of him. But what I hope to achieve tonight anyway is to outline what accomplishments Plaskett made and why he was highly lauded by his fellow astronomers and by the general public, and why I think anyway that he should be much better known among Canadians. He was certainly a world-renowned astronomer. He spent the last 24 years of his life at the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory, where he was the director and founder. The observatory, in case you aren't aware, is about 100 kilometers due south of here on Vancouver Island, just north of Victoria. So these are the awards that he received during his lifetime. As you see, he got 5 honorary degrees. And in true Canadian fashion, the first one he got was not in Canada. Canadians always seem to be slow to recognize their talent. He got it at Pittsburgh and then the others at Canadian universities. He won some very prestigious US awards that are listed there. And in Canada, he became a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 1910. He won that same organization's Flavel Medal in 1932, and he was named a commander of the British Empire, CBE, initials you'll find after his name. And in the UK, he was elected a fellow of the Royal Society, which is still was then and still a very prestigious honor. He won the gold medal of the Royal Astronomical Society. That's in the UK, not Canada. And he delivered what's known as the Halley Lecture in Oxford in 1935. And there's a picture there of what the RAS gold medal looked like. But in spite of this, when he was interviewed by Maclean's magazine late in his life, he was asked, "What is your greatest accomplishment?" And he said, "Getting the funding for the 72-inch, as it was called, or 1.83 meter telescope in Victoria and the observatory to house it." And in a good sense, that's really true. I mean, he couldn't have done any of his research without this wonderful instrument. So it was his greatest achievement, I guess. Yeah, I've got it. So just to fill you in a little bit more about the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory, in case you're not aware of it, it's usually called the DAO because it's such a mouthful otherwise. And that's its address. This is an aerial shot from many years after Plaskett was there. When Plaskett first started at the observatory, the dome and a small residence for himself were the only buildings on the hill. And then in 1924, an office building was erected. That's the place with the red roof. And it's been expanded over the years so that now there are about 30 people on staff, not all astronomers. There are many engineers and postdoctoral people, and of course, other staff to keep the place running. There's a second dome that was opened in the 1960s, 1962, I think, that houses a 48-inch telescope. And there's now a small building that's called the Center of the Universe. It's kind of a big name for a small building, but it houses a small museum and a lecture theater a little bigger than this, where a group of volunteers really runs the Center of the Universe, and they hold star nights on Saturdays and give tours of the observatory. So if you haven't been there, do keep this in mind. It's certainly worth a visit. I think the star parties begin on Astronomy Day in April, and then I think they're every Saturday. It says in the upper right corner, free tickets through Eventbrite. So you can't just show up and hope to see it, but it's you can find it online and easily make a reservation. So this is what the telescope looks like now. And in fact, it's called the Plaskett Telescope now in honor of the first director of the observatory. You probably all know, but anyway, in case some people are watching from online or something, the way it works, the light comes in through the slit in the dome, comes in the upper end of the tube. I guess I could use this pointer instead. The light comes in here, comes down the tube, and hits this big mirror at the base of the telescope. And that mirror is 72 inches across, or 1.83 meters. So that's why it's called a 72-inch telescope. Some people have said to me, ooh, it looks a lot bigger than 72 inches. So it's the diameter of the big mirror. Then the light bounces off that concave mirror, goes back up the tube, up here, and there's a hyperbolic mirror where it's reflected back down the tube. Oops, that wasn't so smart. Back down the tube and goes through a hole in the primary mirror and enters the instrument, which is usually a spectrograph. I'll have a lot more to say about spectrographs and so on later on. Anyway, that's what it's like now. And even though the astronomers that are situated there on the campus, if you like, very few of them use this telescope. The instrument is still in demand by the astronomical community around the world, and apparently is kept, there's more than enough demand for it to be busy every night, even though it's now 104 years old. Not bad for a centenarian. Mind you, a lot of the parts have been replaced and so on, but
is it operated remotely or?
Yes, I believe it is now. I know that's something they were working on, and I think it is a remotely operated telescope. Well, they right from the start, Plaskett was determined to. Whoops! I went too fast from somewhere to somewhere, and back we go. Yeah, Plaskett was very keen on welcoming the public. He realized that it was a federal government observatory. The people of the country had paid for it, so they should be welcomed one night a week at least. And even before the observatory was finished, you can see from this full-page spread in the Victoria newspaper that it was considered a good destination for a little jaunt in the country. And in the background on the left there, you can see the dome still unfinished. It's under construction, and the 1916 Studebaker 6 has chugged up the hill to see what it's like.
Still using the telescope, but the cars have kind of fallen into disuse.
Yes, and that's right. Well, the RASC was the first group to actually visit the observatory, and here's a picture from October 1916. And the only thing was, the mirror was not yet complete. It wasn't even delivered at this point. So they came to visit the observatory. They couldn't see anything through the telescope, but that big round part there at the end is where the mirror would go. And Plaskett and his assistant, Young, the only two astronomers on staff at this point, there's Young. And, so there is Plaskett, the subject of our talk.
Okay.
And right there is his wife, Reba. And there is their young son, who was mentally challenged, Stuart. And I'm not sure, but I think this person here was somebody they employed to help look after Stuart. And over there was Young, Plaskett's only assistant. And in the middle of the picture, there is a man holding an overcoat, who is, his last name was McCurdy, quite a prominent person on Vancouver Island a century ago. And his son in uniform, standing beside him. I've lost the cursor there. Yeah. J.A.D. McCurdy, the first pilot of a powered flight in Canada and a World War I ace. So apparently he was on leave from the, well, I guess it was the RAF, because we didn't have our own Air Force at that time. He was, anyway, there he was with his dad. And so as I said, the McCurdys were a notable family. Their granddaughter, this man, the politicians, this man's granddaughter still lives on the island near Mill Bay. And a filmmaker on the island by the name of Nick Versteeg wanted to make a documentary about the McCurdys, which he's done. And there's a nice little clip in the movie about McCurdy showing some of the construction of the observatory and how the parts all had to be brought by horse and wagon up Observatory Hill. It had 12 horses hauling this heavy equipment. It was really a big deal opening this observatory. It allowed Canada for the first time to participate in research on really an international scale. And as far as astronomy went, to compete with the big American observatories, which were then in California. The Lick Observatory had large telescopes, and Mount Wilson, it didn't have its 100-inch telescope at the time, but it did have a 60-inch.
Any idea how they chose the site for that?
Yes, I do. Well, we'll see a little later in this presentation that Plaskett worked for a time in Ottawa at the old Dominion Observatory, which was, well, it's near Dow's Lake, if you know Ottawa. It's essentially, it's downtown now, but at the time it was suburban Ottawa. And he had an assistant, Harper, Ed Harper, who was the first gold medal winner from the RASC in 1906, I think it was. So he went to work, the day he graduated, he went to work at the Dominion Observatory as Plaskett's assistant. And once the project was approved by the government, which was 1913, Plaskett sent Harper out west to several different sites. As far, like, I remember there was Banff, or somewhere near Banff, somewhere near Penticton, somewhere near Victoria. They didn't know this particular site. And I think there was a place in Lethbridge or somewhere around there. Anyway, yes, they did a lot of site testing, and or at least Harper did. He went on his way out west, he tested, and he had a small refractor, which he would have carried up the mountain. Tried to hire local people to carry the equipment up the mountain so he could actually see what the sky looked like. And he had two criteria: how faint the stars were that could be seen and how good the resolution was, or how well he could separate very near or close binary stars. So he judged the conditions at each site on the way out, and then did the same thing on the way back in case the weather had changed or the climate or something. Anyway, right from the beginning, Harper decided that somewhere around Victoria was probably the best, because the range between the daytime and the nighttime temperatures was small. And they didn't want big temperature fluctuations, as the mirror takes a long time, this big hunk of glass to.
Well, that wasn't November.
Pardon?
So that wasn't November.
It wasn't? You have big temperature ranges in November? Well, I'm sure it was better than Ottawa anyway, where they first thought of putting it. That not only as a scientific advancement for Canada, but in the context of Canadian history, it was really something that fitted in with the way many other developments took place about the time of the First World War. You know, we sometimes think, oh, our Canada, it was born in July the 1st, 1867. Wonderful. But really, Canada behaved like a colony for many, many years after that. We had no foreign embassies and no foreign countries had any consulates or offices here. Everything was done through the colonial office, it was called, in Great Britain. And we had no central bank. And the literature and art that we had before the First World War was all pretty much the same as European art. But then, after the war, in 1919, Canada was one of the countries that actually sat at the Council of Versailles that ended the war. And Canada was a founding member of the League of Nations. And Canada gave the vote to women in 1919, or began to give it. And as we'll see later, it wasn't long after the First World War that we really began to get some true Canadian art that was not just derivative from British art and so on. So I look upon the opening of this observatory as a sort of aspect of Canadian nationhood. And another thing was that the National Research Council began, it wasn't called that at first, but its ancestor began also in 1916. So it was a memorable time for the country. Well, so Plaskett and his staff, which, as I said, only consisted of Young at first, and then Harper, the man I was talking about who did the site testing, he joined them. Plaskett's eldest son, not the one in this picture, but they had an older boy, Harry, who became a world-renowned astronomer too. So there were 4 on the staff early in the history of the observatory, and what they accomplished was quite astounding, I think, considering that they didn't have computers and all that. I've enumerated 4 things here, and I'll talk a bit more about them if you have the interest or if there's time. But basically, he discovered the most massive stars. I say JSP. He led the investigations, but obviously the others made a lot of the observations. He established that interstellar gas in the Milky Way is widespread, and that the stars in the galaxy revolve around a distant center 30,000 light years away, and that the interstellar gas is not stationary, but it rotates too. So what I'd like to do now is take a brief tour of Plaskett's life so that you'll have some feeling for how he came to accomplish so much, what his beginnings were like. Here's the earliest picture we have of him as a little tot. He was, as we know, born in 1865 on a farm. He was the eldest of 10 children. And the farm was about 150 kilometers west of Toronto, near Woodstock, if you know that part of the world. The school he would have attended would have been very much like this. It could have been this one, but this school is only identified as an Oxford County school, so we're not quite sure, but it certainly was a one-room schoolhouse. And the atmosphere in the schools in those days was very competitive. They had, spelling bees, of course, and debates and recitations with prizes. Even on the way to school, they had snowball fights between kids from one school and the neighboring school. And then, of course, when they finished public school, if they wanted to move on to high school, they had to pass this rigorous exam, an entrance exam. And only about half the kids that were in grade 8 managed to get into grade 9. And Plaskett, of course, sailed through with flying colors and started his high school career very well. A picture there also shows the actual farmstead home. Well, as I said, there were 10 kids in the family, and they all had their own individual responsibilities on the farm, but they still had time to explore nature and, you know, have fun as kids. But while his brothers, well, 9 brothers, the sister was the youngest of them all, while they were out hunting and fishing, and amazing to me that they went off hunting with a rifle before they, you know, before they'd even reached the age of going to high school. Anyway, the kids had a pretty good time. They had a lot of work to do too. But John Plaskett, he preferred to tinker with things and build things, even build a violin. But one of the things he built was an electrostatic machine. And I have a picture in case you don't know what that looks like. It's this circular disc, and you turn the crank at the bottom. I guess you can see it without me pointing. I don't know where it is, doesn't matter, but there's a crank you turn and the glass discs turn around, and then eventually there's a spark that jumps between those 2 globes. And it was an early investigation of electricity. And you have to remember that this is at a time, and you know, around 1880, when there were no electric plants. I was kind of surprised to learn that the first city in Canada, or the first community in Canada to have a power plant for electric lighting was Victoria. And that was in 1887. Anyway, I threw this picture in not only to illustrate what an electrostatic machine looks like, but it happens to be an early meeting of the RASC before it was even called the RASC. It was then called the Astronomical Society of Toronto. And the guy with the mutton chops is Andrew Elvins, in case you've heard of him. Anyway, they used to meet in each other's homes, and they were entranced, no doubt, like Plaskett was, with the latest technology. Well, Plaskett had his, you know, enjoyed doing this kind of stuff. And then in grade 10, on his 16th birthday, his father died. And he was the one that had to look after the farm. The younger brothers were not old enough to take responsibility. So suddenly he was thrust into manhood and had to help his mother and look after the farm. He didn't enjoy it. And as he used to try to pay off his brothers, you know, you do this chore and then I won't have to. But anyway, after a short time, and as the other younger brothers matured, John Stanley Plaskett was able to give up the farm work, and he went to work at a machine shop in Woodstock, the nearest town of any size. That's the Whitelaw Foundry and Machine Shop. So this would have been in the early 1880s. And he got lots of practical experience there. He may have even had some early electrical experience. And after a few years there, he had an opportunity to go to Edison Electric in Schenectady, New York, and learn more about building dynamos and doing electrical work. So he found his way back to Canada after that experience in Edison Electric, because they had a plant in Sherbrooke, Quebec. And just by chance, he met a former school chum who said, the University of Toronto Physics Department needs somebody to help maintain the equipment and set up demonstrations and all that kind of thing. So Plaskett moved to Toronto in 1890. And he had really found a job that suited his talents and abilities. There is a typical lab in the upper right corner of physics lab at the time, the university. And Plaskett undoubtedly was the person setting up this equipment for the students to use. He calibrated and modified and even built some of the equipment. And amazingly enough, there is still an 1893 ammeter that it's signed at the bottom there, calibrated by JSP in the date. Most universities would have just thrown this stuff out long ago as antiquated, but somebody had the good sense to maintain it. And in the upper left corner, there's Plaskett sitting at a desk, and a good picture shows that it's actually one of the desks in the lab that he's sitting at. And what he was doing was preparing himself for further study. His wife said to him, "You've got to, if you want to get ahead, you'll have to get more education." So there he was. He'd only had grade 10. So he first of all had to complete his high school requirements, and then he entered into the maths and physics course, and again achieved it with very high marks, but all the time working at his normal work here and doing other things around the university. When they wanted an electrical system, they called on Plaskett, and when somebody wanted a slideshow shown, they called on Plaskett, and all these things. But anyway, he was fortunate that he took this advice and did so well. One of the textbooks that he would have used is Introductory to Physics textbook. This is the frontispiece from the book, and I've included it because spectroscopy, or the study of spectra, was so important in Plaskett's career. And I'll say a little bit more about that, but not knowing really who is in the audience and how much knowledge you have and so on, I brought along, thanks to my daughter's help, 6 little diffraction gratings. If you want one, don't take it away, but pass it along. And what you need to do with this, don't look directly at the light source or you won't see any spectrum, but if you hold it out between the lamps, you'll see the spectrum at 5 different positions. You're sure to see it. So what you'll see looking through that is something akin to what is at the top, a continuous spectrum, the colors from red to blue. It's like this sort of spectrum that an old incandescent lamp would give off, or a very hot glowing body. Then below that, there are various elements listed and what their spectra look like. And then starting down at 9 and 10, instead of having bright lines in the spectrum, there are dark lines. So these 9 and 10 here with the dark lines, they arise because there's a continuous source at the back. I need to tell you about this. It shows what Plaskett would have learned in university about spectra, that there are the different elements have different signatures of the lines are in different places. And then 9 and 10, as I say, are the absorption spectra, where you'd have a continuous source, a source of continuous light, and then it passes through a cooler gas, and the cooler gas absorbs the light in certain regions of the spectrum. And a practical example is number 11, the sun's spectrum. And in this textbook that Plaskett used, there were 3 different star spectra. So Plaskett learned, if you want to say this, he learned a bit about astronomy, but basically he never took an astronomy course. He learned some things in physics about that apply to astronomy, but he didn't formally study astronomy. There was no astronomy course at the University of Toronto. One thing that isn't shown in this diagram, which was vital to Plaskett's research, the lines in the spectrum, let's say these 3 star spectra at the bottom, if, let's say the one of them is Sirius, can't read it from here, but let's say that Sirius is approaching us, then the lines in the spectrum are all shifted slightly to the blue. You can picture the waves coming out of the source, Sirius, and if the source is moving towards you, it's as if the waves are getting compressed, and that means a shorter wavelength, bluer light. On the other hand, if the source is moving away from you, you can picture the waves sort of getting stretched out to longer wavelengths, and that's the red end of the spectrum. So that shifting of the lines was vital to what we're going to talk about if we have a chance. Another thing that really attracted Plaskett's attention while he was still in Toronto was photography. He joined the camera club and he took some very artistic pictures of nature and so on, won some prizes for that. And he produced the first color photograph that was ever published in Canada in 1902, this still life picture. And he did it by combining different, really essentially there are 3 black and white negatives seen through color filters of yellow, red, and blue. And he didn't just, manipulate them until he got a pleasing image. Plaskett actually studied the distribution of the different filters he was using and what would theoretically work. Anyway, there's Plaskett at the University of Toronto doing all these things. His colleagues, at least many of them, thought he'd be a great professor at the university, but well, he wasn't sir at this point, but John A. McLennan was the head of the physics department and was the first person to get a PhD in physics in Canada. Well, he didn't get it in Canada, he got it in England, but the first Canadian to get a PhD in physics. And maybe he thought, oh, well, Plaskett, he's just got his BA, he wouldn't make any professor, although many of them was all they had too. Anyway, Plaskett got the message that he wasn't going to go anywhere if he stayed at U of T. So another lucky break came. Somebody said, oh, they're opening the new observatory in Ottawa, and they will need somebody to maintain their telescope and build spectroscopes and equipment. So why don't you apply for the job? Which he did. And there's a cheery picture of what Ottawa looked like when he went there.
New telescope, that's cool.
Now, it's true the observatory was being built, and it was what's the word I'm looking for? Project, I guess, of W.F. King, who was Canada's chief astronomer. But it wasn't complete when Plaskett went there in 1903. In fact, he worked for 2 or 3 years in an office building just close to here. And you can see in the background the old Parliament buildings before the Great Fire. So it was right downtown. Well, because of Plaskett's photographic talents. He was asked to take pictures of the observatory under construction. And there's a whole series of these beautiful, detailed photographs. Anybody who's interested in building construction, I'm sure, could learn a lot of how they used to have to construct places in the old times. Anyway, within a year of the completion of the observatory, it was opened in 1905, and by 1906, Plaskett was using the telescope there. And this was a refractor. It was 15 inches in diameter, 38 centimeters. So compared to the one in Victoria, which of course is still in the future, it was a pretty small instrument, 15 inches, but that big around, and being a refractor, it had a lens at the front instead of a mirror at the back. And after the light comes down through the telescope, it's focused on a very narrow slit, and then the light passes through the slit into the spectroscope, which you can see at the bottom that Plaskett is standing beside. And so the spectroscope is going to produce an image of the spectrum of whatever it's pointed at, stars usually, and something like what you were looking at. So it was good fortune, really, that W.F. King, the director of the Ottawa Observatory and Canada's chief astronomer, it was fortunate that he recognized that this new astronomy dealing with spectra and photography of spectra and so on, this was a coming field. Up till now, King had only done positional work. He was very active in the survey in Canada, especially the boundary between BC and Alaska. But that was his kind of astronomy, not anything like what he was charging Plaskett to do. So it was a real bold step on King's part to say, you're going to look after this new stuff. And Plaskett didn't know anything. He until 1905, when the observatory opened, as far as anybody knows, he'd never handled a telescope. He never studied astronomy, but here he was given this huge responsibility. And another responsibility he was given by King was, oh, there's an eclipse coming in Labrador in August. You should plan the expedition. So that Plaskett did, and they had to ship tons of equipment from Ottawa to Labrador by steamship, and it all had to be organized pretty fast. And in fact, it was the RASC that sort of pushed the government to do it. The society said, look, we're going to have Americans and British coming here to look at the eclipse, and we're not going to send any of our own people. It's crazy. So they did it, and a number of RASC people were invited and participated in this very big expedition to Labrador. So Plaskett took lots of lovely pictures, and there's an album on the RASC archives, which you can see online. And I just love these timely old photos. And here's one of the setups. Then in Labrador, the two people facing the camera are King on the left and Plaskett on the right. And this was to study the solar spectrum at the time of the eclipse. And just to on the right-hand side of the image, you can see a big round mirror that reflects the light from the sun down this very long tube. You can only see the beginning of it, down to another mirror, like maybe 100 feet away maybe, and back to where they're making their observations of or hope to make their observations of the eclipse. but as luck would have it, it was cloudy and rainy and they saw nothing. However, this equipment, which was called a coelostat, which attracts the sky or the sun and keeps the image of the sun focused in one particular place, it was used back in Ottawa in a setup like this, which you can see better than you could in the previous slide. The Dominion Observatory itself, the building is on the left, and then on the extreme right is a sort of a roof with two louvers in the top. And you can see the mirror there, which is the sunlight comes down, hits the mirror, comes up into this long mirror, which has louvers to allow air circulation. And then it gets reflected back down to the little hut, and then it gets reflected from there back down through this long building into the basement of the observatory, where they could study the spectrum of the sun. And Plaskett devised a special kind of device so that he could align the slit on the spectrograph parallel to the edge of the sun and move it around to different positions so that he would know well, as I said about the shifting of the lines as the sun approaches or the star approaches or whatever. So the one limb of the sun is approaching us, and the lines that he was observing on that side of the sun were slightly shifted to the blue, and on the other side of the sun, which was receding from us as it rotated on its axis, they would be shifted to the red. So he was able to measure the difference between the wavelength shift on one side and the other and study the rotation of the sun. All that was a project initiated by a body called the International Solar Union. And Plaskett, by 1910, 5 years after the observatory opened, was considered a sufficient expert to attend their meeting in Mount Wilson. And it turned out to be quite an influential meeting. I've just highlighted some people there that were very important to him. If you know your RASC history, you'll recognize C.A. Chant at the extreme right. He was a professor of astronomy at U of T, but not in Plaskett's day, though he was born the same year as Plaskett, but he only was able to start an astronomy course several years after Plaskett had left. And he was very important to the RASC. Anyway, they not only had their meetings and decided who was going to measure what, but Plaskett also, and all the delegates, got to see this 60-inch, 1.52 meter telescope at Mount Wilson, which was then the world's largest. And Plaskett thought, Canada needs a decent telescope like this, something we should have, at least this big or bigger. So from 1910 onwards, he was trying actively to get his boss and everybody else to take an interest in the project. He spoke to, first of all, he organized various groups, the American Astronomical Society, the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, or anybody, any group that he thought would have an interest in seeing Canada advance in the world of science. He appealed to them. And then he went to the members of Parliament that he thought might have an interest in such a project and tried to get them behind it. And then he talked to the cabinet members and kept pushing the pressure on. He eventually had a meeting with Prime Minister Borden, who was just then on the verge of going to England to talk about lending Britain warships in case the war might materialize. So there were other pressing things on the government's mind, but Nonetheless, he persuaded the government to finance the observatory in 1913. Fortunately, they didn't wait another year. Let's see where I am here. Okay, so we'll skip now to 1917, and he moved to Victoria just before the observatory was complete, of course. An awful lot of work went on in the meanwhile, with Plaskett traveling to Pittsburgh, where the mirror was going to be made, and to Cleveland, where the mounting was made, and back and forth, and changing designs and all that kind of stuff. But as you can see by the picture here and earlier pictures of the telescope, he didn't adopt the design that he'd seen in Mount Wilson. That design from Mount Wilson, maybe I should just go back to it if I don't mess this up. Whoop. That design, called a fork mounting, he soon was told by the people that used it, it had its flaws. The top end would tend to bend down from the weight, and it bent by different amounts depending on the direction it was pointed. So he thought, we got to have a better kind of mounting. And so he went for this that's called a cross-axis mount. It had been used before, but on smaller scale. This is the first time that it was used for such a large telescope. And over the years, in the future, that design was copied or very nearly replicated in Perkins Observatory in Ohio in the upper left, in Japan, in Australia, and South Africa. So every continent in the world had a telescope that looked quite a lot like what Plaskett had initially planned for Victoria. I better keep moving on, eh?
Yeah, we're getting a little short of time.
Yeah. Okay. So I mentioned that one of his great discoveries was the most massive stars. One in particular, well, we say a star, but it actually was two stars, but so close together that even the powerful Mount Wilson telescope, even the DAO telescope couldn't resolve that there were two stars. It only looked like one. But by studying the spectrum, Plaskett inferred there were two stars and was able to determine their mass. And they turned out to be the most massive stars that were known to that date. And that investigation was very important to understanding evolution of stars. That's just a close-up view. I won't take the time to do that. International meetings, they were vital to Plaskett because there was nobody in Canada really to talk to on a par with what he was doing. This was a meeting in Leiden in the Netherlands, which was especially important. And if you look really closely on the left-hand margin of this, you see a man sort of stooping over, looking into his camera, left-hand margin, and he's got a hat on, and it's Plaskett. I give up on that. Anyway, always the photographer. Plaskett was there, but he had to go to Holland on crutches because he'd fallen off the observing ladder at the observatory in Victoria, you know, observing in the dark, and missed a step and broke his leg. And of course, a trip overseas in those days was no small feat. You had to travel across the country on the train and then travel across the ocean on the liner and reverse the process. And this particular trip and similar ones, he went to Europe 5 times. It cost about a quarter of his annual salary. And the government, of course, balked at every single one of them, and he had to cajole and persuade them. And it was not easy, but he persisted and got there. Well, I am managing to move along here. This is the familiar view of our magnificent Milky Way. We're used to seeing it from inside, as it were. But what Plaskett achieved was figuring out what our galaxy would look like if we could travel, say, 100,000 light years off into the distance and look back. And he came up with this diagram, and he presented that in 1935, the year he retired. And he presented that in England, and it's still pretty much the standard model for what our galaxy would look like from outside. It's really remarkable that there are galaxies that he had never seen that actually do look like that. And of course, our neighboring galaxy in Andromeda is very similar to our own, but not seen edge on. Well, after Plaskett passed on, he wasn't forgotten. There's a large crater on the moon called Plaskett near the northern limb. Then an astronomer by the name of Donald Morton and some of his astronomer friends belonged to the Alpine Club. They were hiking in the Rockies and decided to name a mountain after Plaskett. There's his former home in Esquimalt, now demolished, where he lived in retirement. And the street on which this house used to be is now called Plaskett Place. So just to try to sum up, he influenced, he was a strong influence in many ways in telescope design and spectrograph design. He was really keen on public outreach. He gave about 4 lectures a year to the public, plus a whole bunch to his professional colleagues. He wrote popular articles. He always encouraged visits to the observatory. He compiled large surveys or lists of various types of stars. And of course, he had colleagues whom he influenced. I just mention or sort of underline there, Helen Hogg, you may have heard of, outstanding Canadian female astronomer. H.H. Plaskett, his son, who was, as I said, went to Oxford eventually. Redman was an English astronomer who came to the observatory. We now call him a postdoctoral student. The term didn't exist at the time. And there were various research visitors who came from all over the world to spend a short time there, and all benefited from the telescope and from Plaskett's advice. One thing that hasn't changed in all these years, in my opinion, is personal characteristics. And I have tried to summarize what I think were Plaskett's personal traits that we can all learn from. He was always willing to ask for help. He was always cheerful. He gave credit, whether to his spouse, his boss, advisors, the government. He was determined, that's for sure. And sometimes that determination was like an ego that annoyed his colleagues. And he had faith in a higher power. He was an Anglican all his life, and as many of his contemporaries were. He was on the building committee of the cathedral in Victoria, and in a parish church in Victoria, there's a lovely stained glass window to his memory. So I'll just end by saying, I think that Plaskett deserves to be as well known as these contemporaries that are so familiar to Canadians, and these are people from the same period of time. The Group of Seven, Stephen Leacock, Emily Carr, Lucy Maud Montgomery. They're more or less household names, or at least we think people should know them, but nobody seems to know, except you 3 select people, knows about Plaskett. And so I will conclude with thank you. And
well, thank you very much, Peter. Appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that he was on slide 22 of 44 at about 1 minute to 8, and it's 8:07 and he's finished. So I thought that was pretty remarkable shift in pace. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you picked that up.